Continuing on, the next area that's influenced by policy is oil and energy. And what we can see from this chart here that I'm showing you, this goes back approximately 10 years. And what you can see is the price of oil back in about 2008, 2009, priced out at almost $130 a barrel. We see it drop, drop, drop. We see it come back. We see it drop. And we now see it sitting at about $62.82 a barrel. So that's what's happened with the price. And this is an input cost to so many different industries, but it also affects you and I, the consumer. So depending on the price of oil affects the price of gas and some of the things that we do. Now you ask, well, why does the price change that much? And if you look, it's a basic supply and demand. The blue line being here, world production, world consumption. And when we have consumption over production, we have growth. Now, what happens is sometimes oil and gas is more valuable the higher the price. So what happens is the higher the price, more people go to produce oil, which creates a glut of oil, which drives the price down. So the market is always trying to figure that equilibrium, but the oil market is very impacted by anticipated worldwide growth, geopolitical events, and so forth. But it's a very important one to focus on what the price of oil is, because it can be a good indicator of where things are going. The next piece is what drives interest rates. And we talk about interest rates as being, the Fed controls them, and not necessarily true. But the supply and demand for money is just there. The more money that's in demand by businesses, the higher the rate. The lower the demand for money, the lower the price. So we also see this in economies from a macro sense, is that if you have very low interest rates, it's to stimulate the economy. Higher interest rates are trying to manage inflation and have controlled growth. So interest rates, besides supply and demand, are a function of the risk and return profile. The longer the term, the higher the risk. Conversely, the shorter the term, the lower the risk in a standard yield curve environment. The greater the credit risk, the higher the rate. The better the credit, the lower the rate. The U.S. government's securities are assumed to have no principal risk because the federal government, they're backed by the full faith and government of the U.S., and the government can just print more money. They do have inflation risk, however. So if that we start with, the first thing I'd like to introduce is the central banks. Every country has a central bank. Some are independent of the government itself, such as the Federal Reserve Bank, and others are just the government itself. Now, when we look at this, is that Congress oversees the Federal Reserve System. And they have a Board of Governors, which is an independent agency of the federal government. Then there's local Federal Reserve banks, and they're supervised by the Board of Governors. But these banks are spread around. And this goes back historically to where business was done, that they could be participants in that community. But the most important thing is the Federal Open Market Committee, which are members of the Board of Directors and the Board of Governors and some of the presidents. So this is the structure of our central bank. When we look at the Federal Reserve, they have what we call a dual mandate of having price stability, inflation being under control, and maximum employment. You don't want inflation high, too high, low. You don't want employment, so you find this balance. And price stability, it's moving along. It's not going fast. Experience over time, if we were to look at some graphs, the economy performs well when inflation is low and expected to be low and predictable. To some degree, that's what we're seeing today. But one of the things, the tools they have, and there's really three things that the Federal Reserve can do. One is the open market operations. And this is where they buy, sell treasury bonds to affect bank reserves. It's a major foreign policy, buying and selling bonds. The discount window. lends to member banks to affect reserves. Purpose is to target a range for the Federal Reserve rate. Okay, this is a range. Okay, and they're trying to target the short-term lending between banks, the Fed funds rate. That is what the Fed sets. They don't set long-term interest rates. They set a Fed funds rate, target rate. Okay, and this is trying to incent that the market will find the right space in between. Then there's the required reserve ratio. How much does a bank have to keep in reserves? Okay, on deposit with the Fed. So all of these are policy tools that they can do. The bottom line of it all, long-term rates are set by the market. Willing buyer, willing seller. But it takes into account a lot of different things. This is the yield curve. The blue is as of today, May of 17 and May of 2018. And what we traditionally see is what we'll call a normal yield curve, meaning that the longer the rate or the duration, the longer the maturity, the higher the rate. So we see that in 17, we see that in 18, it's starting to flatten. But right now what we see is short-term rates, it's almost inverted. So when we look at the gap between these, that is telling us that people are willing to pay more short-term than long-term. When we look at the 10-year Treasury rate less the 2-year Treasury, what we can see here is the spread had been way up there, and the spread is now down to like 20 basis points. So that becomes important. Think about this for a second. This has predicted recessions every time. What are some of the other policy impacts? We got environment and energy, healthcare, food, transportation, worker safety, consumer protection, finance, agriculture, immigration. All of these have trying to achieve a short-term purpose, but oftentimes they have a longer-term impact. They can't change those mega trends that we saw. Okay? Each of these may be a policy to implement, but it has an impact. It can be positive or it can be negative. Where we come down to a safety in transportation, we need to ask the question, what happened with the Boeing 737 MAX? It appears that the government gave all that responsibility to the company. And when the company took it over, it simply, did they cut costs? I don't know. I don't know that we'll ever know. But a lot of these regulations can have negative and or positive effects. So that's sort of the other policy issues that we see. I think if you put it all together, I think I'd be cautious. I think we're going to see worldwide growth, a little better growth here in the U.S., but I think we're going to expect a lot of volatility in headwinds as we do this. So how does this relate to this course? Firms or businesses operate within this economic environment. Okay, these strategic, they have to address these mega trends, what's happening in the economy, their picture for the future, and the policy issues. Because they have to develop strategy, and strategy just isn't about dollars. It's about human capital, it's about capital allocation decisions, production, etc. It's used to estimate future earnings and cash flow. So it's a direct relationship. We can't look at finance, we can't look at organizational behavior without understanding the environment in which the firm is doing business. That becomes very important. And the more we are aware of what's going on, we can understand and be more helpful at making recommendations. How does these things impact you personally? Clearly there's a benefit to you as an individual. Jobs, jobs, jobs. They can give you a prediction of what jobs may be in demand, and you can focus on your skill development, your ability to support yourself and your family, your quality of life. Okay? So if we have pull back a lot of environmental reviews and our air quality or water quality deteriorates, that's a quality of life issue. But there's others that are there too. We have ability to create wealth, planning for the future. So these things impact you too. So as we move forward in the semester, the 6 weeks, what we're going to be able to do is see how these megatrends, these current issues, policy, how do we apply them in finance? How do we apply them in organizational behavior? Thank you. If you have any questions, please let me know.